The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the parched earth. The air was thick with heat, the kind that made even the smallest movement feel like an effort. It was late April when Rachel Matthews, a 27-year-old backpacker from Seattle, set out on what should have been a routine solo hike through the Sonoran Desert. She was an experienced adventurer, well-versed in survival and navigation, with a passion for exploring the wilderness on her own terms. This particular trip was to be a journey into the heart of the desert, a place where few dared to tread. Rachel had planned to spend several days hiking the rugged trails near the Arizona border, taking in the isolation and raw beauty of the landscape before returning to civilization. She left a note for her family and friends, telling them of her plans, but no one expected anything unusual. Rachel was known for her independent streak, always seeking solitude in nature. But as the days passed, her family began to worry. She was overdue to check in, and when they called the ranger station, they learned that Rachel hadn't been seen since she registered for her hike. A search was initiated immediately. The Arizona desert was unforgiving, a vast expanse of rocks, cacti, and sand that swallowed everything in its path. The terrain was treacherous, especially for someone hiking alone. Temperatures soared into the triple digits during the day, and at night, the cold was biting. The rangers and volunteers combed the area, looking for signs of Rachel, but despite their efforts, they found nothing. No tracks, no trail, no backpack, nothing to indicate where she might have gone. The search lasted for weeks, but the more they looked, the more they realized something disturbing. It was as if Rachel had vanished into thin air. 6 months later, with no sign of Rachel and no leads to follow, the search was called off. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons report, though the authorities were baffled. There were no signs of foul play, no indication that she had been kidnapped or attacked. It was as though the desert had swallowed her whole, leaving no trace behind. And then, 8 years later, something unimaginable happened. A group of hikers exploring a remote canyon in the same region stumbled upon a discovery that would reignite the investigation into Rachel Matthews' disappearance. The hikers had ventured off the main trail, hoping to explore an uncharted section of the desert that had been largely untouched by human activity. The canyon they found was hidden from view, its narrow entrance obscured by the landscape. As they made their way through the narrow passageways, one of the hikers noticed something strange on the canyon wall, something that shouldn't have been there. A name etched deeply into the stone: Rachel Matthews. The hikers froze. At first, they thought it was some kind of graffiti, a random marking from another hiker or explorer. But as they examined it more closely, they realized that the name had been carved into the rock with care, the grooves deep and unmistakably human. The letters were crude, the kind of carving you might expect from someone desperate, someone with limited tools. The rock surrounding the etching was weathered, but the name itself was still clear. The hikers immediately contacted the authorities, who arrived at the site within hours. The discovery set off a wave of questions and speculation. Why had Rachel's name been carved into the wall of an isolated canyon? Had she been alive when it was done? And if so, why hadn't anyone ever found it before? The news of the discovery quickly spread, and the case that had long been closed was reopened. Investigators and forensic teams were dispatched to the canyon to examine the site. But the questions only multiplied. The first and most pressing question: how had Rachel ended up in that remote canyon? No known trail led to it, and there were no signs that anyone had visited it in years. The area was so far off the beaten path that it seemed almost impossible that Rachel could have stumbled upon it by accident. Had she been led there? Had someone else brought her? As the investigation unfolded, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Rachel had been an experienced hiker, someone who knew how to survive in the desert, someone who wouldn't have gotten lost. She had planned her trip carefully, leaving detailed information about her route with her family. And yet, despite all of that, there was no explanation for how she had ended up in this remote canyon, alone and carved into the rock. One of the key discoveries came from examining the etching itself. Experts determined that the carving was made with a sharp object, possibly a knife or a rock, but it was difficult to say how long ago it had been done. The dry desert air had preserved the rock's surface, but the edges of the etching had softened over time, making it harder to pinpoint an exact time frame. The biggest question that remained was why the name had been left there. Had Rachel done it herself? Or had someone else done it for her? To answer that, the authorities turned to Rachel's belongings. Her backpack, which had never been found, had become the subject of much speculation. Was it lost, or had it been taken? Had Rachel had the opportunity to leave any clues behind, or had she been caught by something, or someone, before she could finish her journey? The lack of evidence in the area where she had been last seen suggested that whatever had happened to her, it had been sudden and unexpected. As the investigation continued, a few disturbing theories began to take shape. Some speculated that Rachel had been abducted, but there was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of forced entry or resistance. Others believed that she had gotten lost, wandered off her intended path, and eventually succumbed to the harsh conditions of the desert. But Rachel's experience and careful planning made that scenario unlikely. Was it possible that she had encountered something, someone, out in the wilderness, and that had led to her disappearance? Investigators turned to local legends, hoping to uncover anything that could explain Rachel's disappearance. The Sonoran Desert, like many remote areas, was rich with stories, tales of strange creatures, of lost travelers, of eerie disappearances. One legend in particular stood out. It spoke of a hidden force, a kind of darkness that had settled into the canyon walls, an ancient presence that drew people to it, only to claim them. These stories were dismissed as folklore by most, but they were troublingly persistent. Over the years, hikers and locals had spoken in hushed tones about something in the desert, something that wasn't quite natural. People who ventured too far off the trails sometimes didn't return. Some had said they felt an oppressive force, an overwhelming urge to go deeper into the desert, to explore places where no one should go. The discovery of Rachel's name etched into the canyon wall seemed to confirm these stories, but it didn't provide any clear answers. Had Rachel become one of the many lost souls in the desert, her name left as a final, desperate message? Or was there something else, something more sinister, behind her disappearance? As the investigation continued, the questions became more urgent. Theories were proposed, but none fully explained what had happened to Rachel Matthews. The desert, with its vastness and isolation, had swallowed her whole, and yet, despite all the efforts to understand her disappearance, the answers remained elusive. What really happened out there, in the unforgiving Arizona wilderness? Had Rachel's name been carved in the canyon wall by her own hand, or had someone else left it there? And why did the desert continue to claim its victims, one after another, without explanation? The investigation had just begun, but one thing was clear. There were forces in the Arizona desert that could not be easily understood, forces that had been waiting, drawing in anyone who dared to come too close. The investigation into Rachel Matthews' disappearance had barely begun, and already it was clear that the desert held far more secrets than anyone had anticipated. The discovery of her name, etched into the hidden canyon wall, was not just a strange anomaly, it was a key, one that could lead them to answers, but also one that might lead them deeper into the unknown. Forensic teams and investigators scoured the canyon, trying to uncover more clues about how Rachel had gotten there. But the walls of the canyon seemed to be holding their secrets tightly, like an ancient vault. The ground around the etching was disturbed, as though someone had recently moved through the area, but there were no clear footprints, no signs of struggle, and no indication that anyone had been there for long. It was as though Rachel had appeared out of nowhere and left nothing but her name behind. Theories began to emerge, each one more unsettling than the last. One of the first things the investigators noticed was the lack of any physical evidence of Rachel's presence in the canyon. No backpack, no equipment, no personal belongings. Everything she had been carrying with her on her hike had seemingly disappeared. It was as if she had entered the canyon with nothing more than the clothes on her back. Had she discarded her belongings in a panic, or had someone or something taken them from her? The authorities had to consider the possibility that Rachel hadn't simply wandered into the canyon by accident. This part of the desert was treacherous, with hidden ravines, shifting rock formations, and intense heat. The idea that she had found her way into such a remote location without any help seemed implausible. The more they looked into her last known movements, the more it seemed as though Rachel had been led there, intentionally drawn to this place, to that very spot where her name had been carved. And then there was the eerie message itself, the name carved into the wall. Forensic experts had confirmed that the etching was done with a sharp object, and it had been carefully placed, deep enough into the stone to last for years, yet rough enough to suggest urgency. Rachel's name had been written deliberately, but with no explanation, no context. Theories swirled. Was it a message to someone? A last act of defiance? Or was it a desperate cry for help, an attempt to leave a trace before she vanished entirely? As the weeks went by, investigators scoured the nearby areas for any other signs of Rachel. Her family, desperate for answers, held out hope that she had somehow survived the harsh conditions of the desert. They clung to the idea that she might have found shelter in one of the hidden caves or crevices that dotted the landscape. But each search turned up nothing. Rachel's journal, which had been found among her belongings before the trip, gave little insight into what had happened. The entries leading up to her disappearance were typical for someone preparing for a solo hike. She had mentioned the desert's beauty, the solitude, and her excitement about exploring a new part of the country. But then, there was a sudden shift in tone. The entries grew shorter, more fragmented, and in the days leading up to her departure, they stopped altogether. In her final entry, Rachel had written, "I'm following a trail. It feels like I've found something I'm supposed to see, something important, but it's not what I expected. I think I'm getting close, but I don't know how much longer I can keep going." The abruptness of the last entry haunted Claire Donovan, the investigative journalist who had been covering the case since Rachel's name was discovered in the canyon. Claire had read through Rachel's journal several times, hoping to find a clue that would make sense of what had happened. But nothing fit. There were no mentions of strange encounters, no indication that Rachel had encountered anything or anyone that might explain why she would leave such an urgent message. In a desperate attempt to uncover more, Claire contacted the local tribal leaders who had lived in the area for generations, hoping they might know something about the ancient forces that seemed to be at play in the desert. These were the same legends that had been whispered about for years, stories of people who had disappeared without a trace, their names never spoken again. The elders told Claire of an ancient belief that had been passed down through their families for centuries. According to their legends, the desert held a hidden power, a place where time and space twisted and warped. Those who ventured too far into its depths could lose their way, not just in the physical sense, but in a much deeper, more existential way. It was as if the desert had the ability to draw people into itself, to pull them into another reality, one where time no longer followed the rules they understood. One elder spoke of a place deep within the desert, a hidden canyon where the spirits of those who had been lost over the centuries were said to gather. It was a place that no one dared go, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, and where the desert seemed to consume everything that came too close. The elder spoke of the voice of the wind, a mythical force that was said to call to those who had been chosen, those who had unknowingly crossed a threshold, drawn toward the desert's ancient power. Could Rachel have been drawn to this hidden place? This forgotten corner of the desert where the forces of nature and time converged? Had she unknowingly crossed that threshold, succumbing to the call of the voice of the wind? And if so, what had happened to her? Was she alive, lost somewhere in the vastness of the desert? Or had the desert taken her as it had taken others before her? As Claire returned to the site of the canyon, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were there, hidden in the landscape, in the very rocks and sand that had witnessed countless disappearances over the centuries. The canyon, with its eerie silence and strange energy, seemed to hold something more, something deeper, something that couldn't be explained by logic or science alone. Claire stood before the etched name on the canyon wall, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, as though the very desert was watching her, waiting for her to understand. The name Rachel Matthews was still there, etched into the stone with an eerie permanence. But what did it mean? Had Rachel carved it herself, or had someone else done it for her, as a message to the world? The mystery of her disappearance and the strange connection to the canyon was far from over. As Claire stood in the silence, she could almost hear it, the wind whispering in her ears, urging her to go further, to uncover what had been hidden in the desert for so long. But was she ready to face the truth? Would the answers she sought bring her peace, or would they draw her into the same fate that had befallen Rachel and so many others before her? The canyon waited, and the desert was always watching. The search for Rachel Matthews had long since shifted from a missing persons case to something more sinister, something that felt beyond the realm of a simple disappearance. The discovery of her name etched into the hidden canyon wall had set the wheels of the investigation in motion once again, but it wasn't just the etching itself that had captivated the authorities. It was the unanswered questions surrounding it, the eerie sense of something ancient and inexplicable that seemed to be guiding the investigation, pulling it deeper into the unknown. Claire Donovan, the investigative journalist who had taken up Rachel's case with an intensity matched only by her desire for the truth, had grown increasingly obsessed with the idea that there was something in the desert that had claimed Rachel, something far older than anything they could understand, an ancient force tied to the land itself. As she continued her research, Claire became more certain that Rachel hadn't simply disappeared. She had been lured to something. But what? The mystery surrounding Rachel's last days before vanishing was far from resolved. As Claire pored over Rachel's journal, which was the only personal item found among the sparse belongings she had brought with her on her trip, she was struck by the incoherence of the final entries. Rachel had written about her sense of unease, her growing belief that she was following a trail to something significant. But the further Claire read, the more she felt that Rachel had been spiraling into something darker, something beyond her control. "I feel like I'm being led to something, like the desert is calling me," Rachel had written in one of her final journal entries, dated just days before she was last heard from. "But I'm not sure if I want to know what it is. I feel like I'm being pulled, not just by the landscape, but by something inside me." The last sentence had stopped Claire cold. "I can't turn back now. It's too late." What had Rachel meant? Had she been describing a realization, a moment of clarity before something went horribly wrong? Or had she been losing her grip on reality, falling victim to something far darker, far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated? Claire couldn't help but return to the image of the canyon wall where Rachel's name had been carved. It wasn't just any place. It was a hidden, isolated canyon, tucked away deep in the Sonoran Desert, far from any established trail. The etching was the last known evidence of Rachel's presence, a haunting final message left behind in a place that no one would have ever thought to look. The more Claire investigated, the more she became convinced that the desert had played a role in Rachel's disappearance, but not in the way that the authorities had assumed. The desert wasn't just a hostile environment that had claimed Rachel through exposure or a tragic accident. There was something about that part of the desert that called to people, something about it that had a magnetic pull, like a force reaching out from beneath the earth itself. The National Park Service had conducted an exhaustive search after Rachel was reported missing, but they hadn't gone as far into the remote canyons as they should have. There were parts of the desert that were too dangerous to navigate, even for experienced searchers. Claire had learned that the land had a reputation, one whispered about among local guides, hikers, and residents. A reputation for claiming people, for drawing them in and leaving them lost forever. These were stories that people didn't speak of openly, tales of people who had vanished in the desert, their bodies never found, their names never spoken again. Claire's pursuit of the truth led her to an unexpected source, an elderly man named Oliver, a retired ranger who had worked in the desert for more than 30 years. His stories were fragmented, almost reluctant, but he eventually opened up to her, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid of being overheard. "There's something out there," Oliver had said, his eyes darting around nervously. "Something ancient. Something that draws people in, makes them do things they wouldn't normally do. I've seen it. I've seen it in the eyes of people who've gone too far. People who feel like they're meant to be in this desert, like they've been called here." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her voice low, leaning in closer. "People don't talk about it. They just disappear. The land, it's different in certain places. There's a point, an area, deep in the desert. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's just the heat playing tricks on you. But it's real. Something happens when you get close to it. You start feeling things. You start hearing things. It pulls you in. You can't resist it." Claire listened intently, her mind racing. What Oliver was describing sounded like something out of a supernatural tale, a force that pulled people into the desert, drawing them towards something hidden, something dangerous. Was this what had happened to Rachel? Had she been led into that canyon by the desert itself, by this ancient, unseen force? Oliver's eyes darkened as he continued. "It's not just an accident. No, it's not like that. People are drawn to it, like moths to a flame. They don't know why. They can't explain it. And once they get too close, there's no turning back." Claire couldn't shake the weight of his words. She had to know more. What had happened to Rachel? Had she fallen prey to this unseen force? And if so, was there any way to stop it from claiming others? Her search took her deeper into the canyon system near Depot Bay, where Rachel had been last seen. As Claire navigated the narrow, winding paths through the jagged cliffs, she could feel the weight of the land pressing down on her. It was as if the air itself had thickened, as if the land was watching, waiting. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence, the distance between her and the rest of the world growing wider with every step. It was when Claire stumbled upon a hidden cave, its entrance concealed by overgrown brush, that she felt the first stirrings of the force Oliver had described. The cave was cold, damp, and oppressive, as though it had been waiting for her. The walls inside were smooth, the rock worn by centuries of erosion. It felt ancient. It felt alive. The further Claire ventured into the cave, the more the air seemed to thrum with energy. She could almost hear a low hum, barely perceptible, vibrating through her chest. The deeper she went, the more she could sense the pull, the force that had drawn Rachel into the desert. It wasn't just the physical environment. It was something else, something buried deep beneath the land itself, something older than anything she could comprehend. Then, in the dim light of her flashlight, she saw it, a symbol, faint but unmistakable, carved into the rock. It was the same symbol she had seen in Rachel's journal, the same one that had appeared on the canyon wall. The eye, the mark of the force that had been drawing Rachel into the desert, pulling her toward this very place. Claire's heart pounded as she stepped back, her mind racing with the implications. The force, the eye, was real. It had claimed Rachel just as it had claimed others before her. The desert was not just a place of survival, it was a place of power, a place that consumed those who were unlucky enough to stumble upon its secret. But what was the eye? What did it want? And why had Rachel been the one to discover it? As Claire stood in the cave, the walls seeming to close in around her, she knew that the answers were here, buried in the land, in the symbols, in the hidden forces that had been waiting for her all along. But as the air grew heavier, thicker, she couldn't help but wonder, had she come too close? Was the desert, the eye, drawing her in as it had drawn Rachel? The truth was out there, but the more Claire uncovered, the more she realized that some truths might be better left buried. The discovery of the symbol inside the cave was a turning point. It felt like Claire had crossed an invisible boundary, one that separated the logical from the inexplicable. The eye, that ancient force she had been warned about, was no longer just a myth or local legend. It was real, and now it was watching her. She took a step back from the symbol, her breath coming faster as the reality of the situation set in. The air in the cave had become dense, almost suffocating. The low hum she had felt earlier seemed to intensify, vibrating through her body, a subtle but undeniable force. Claire's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything she had uncovered. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the pieces of the puzzle were slipping further away from her grasp. The desert, the canyon, the symbol. It was all part of something much larger than she could comprehend. She pulled out her notebook, frantically scribbling down her thoughts. The eye, the force that had claimed Rachel, was part of the land itself, buried deep in the desert, hidden from the world. It wasn't just a physical place. It was something that connected the very essence of the earth and the people who ventured too close. And Rachel, with her curiosity, had been drawn into it, just like so many others before her. But there was more. Claire remembered the strange pattern of disappearances that had plagued the desert for decades. These weren't random accidents. These were people who had vanished, not just physically, but from the very fabric of reality itself. What if the eye didn't just take people? It consumed them, erasing them from time and space, trapping them within the land forever. Claire's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something shifting in the cave. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt colder, heavier, and the faint hum of energy grew louder, more intense. The symbol on the wall seemed to pulse with light, and Claire felt an overwhelming urge to step closer, to touch it. It was as if the eye was calling to her, pulling her toward the center of the mystery she had uncovered. With a shaky breath, she reached out and placed her hand on the rock. The moment her fingers made contact, a rush of energy surged through her body. It was as if the entire cave had come alive, as if the land itself was reacting to her presence. The walls seemed to close in, and the ground beneath her feet trembled, just as it had in the clearing by the altar. She pulled her hand away in shock, but the hum continued, vibrating through the stone, resonating in her chest. Claire stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The eye was alive. It was not just a force of nature. It was a presence, one that fed on the living, drawing them into its depths, erasing them from time. And Rachel, like the others, had been consumed by it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The desert had claimed Rachel, just as it had claimed so many before her. And now, Claire was next. She turned and ran from the cave, her breath ragged, her legs unsteady beneath her. The fog had thickened outside, swirling in the air, making it harder to see. The sound of the desert seemed to grow louder, the wind howling through the canyon, the distant crash of waves against the rocks. But beneath it all, Claire could hear it, the low hum of the eye, calling to her, pulling her back. She stumbled through the narrow path, her heart racing, and for the first time, she realized that the desert wasn't just vast, it was infinite. No matter how far she ran, no matter how fast, she would always feel the pull. The eye was in the land, in the air, in the very earth beneath her feet. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Claire reached the edge of the canyon, her chest heaving as she collapsed to the ground. She looked back at the darkened path leading deeper into the desert, the fog swirling around the cliffs. The canyon was silent now, but Claire knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, just out of sight, ready to claim the next person who dared to venture too close. But the worst part was the realization that the desert had claimed her too. It had marked her, just as it had marked Rachel. There was no escaping it now. The force that had drawn Rachel into the desert had done the same to Claire. She had uncovered the truth, but in doing so, she had also sealed her fate. She glanced down at the journal she had been holding, the pages now stained with sweat and dust. The final entry Rachel had written echoed in her mind. "I can't turn back now. It's too late." Claire understood now. She was too far gone. The desert had taken hold of her, just as it had with Rachel, and the land would not let her go. She had become part of it, part of the eye. And once the desert claimed you, there was no return. The wind picked up again, howling through the canyon, as if urging her to step back into the unknown. The force was calling to her, drawing her in, and Claire knew that no matter how hard she tried, she could never escape. The desert had claimed her, and like the others before her, she was now part of its endless story, a name etched in the rocks of time, lost to the land that had consumed her. She stood up, her body trembling, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she understood the desert. She understood the force that had lured her here. It was a part of her now, and there was no going back. The eye had claimed her, and she would never leave. It was the desert's way. It always took, and it never let go. The desert had a way of swallowing everything. It consumed time, memory, and space, leaving only the lingering echoes of what had once been. Claire stood at the edge of the canyon, the vastness of the Arizona wilderness stretching out before her like a silent, waiting predator. The wind cut through the air, carrying with it a dryness that seemed to seep into her very soul. She had uncovered the truth, at least part of it. The desert had claimed Rachel Matthews, just as it had claimed so many before her. And now, it was claiming Claire too. Her legs felt like lead as she walked away from the canyon, back toward the small trail that led toward the town. But as she walked, the weight of what she had discovered settled heavily on her chest. The eye, that ancient force buried deep within the desert, had drawn Rachel in. But it hadn't just taken her body, it had taken her essence, her very spirit, leaving only a name carved into the stone, a final mark before the land consumed her. Claire's breath hitched as she remembered the faint whisper in her mind, the voice that had called to her from the depths of the canyon. "You are part of it now. You will never escape." It was as though the desert itself had woven itself into her very being, and no matter how far she walked, no matter how fast she ran, she would never be free of it. The air was thick with a strange energy as Claire made her way through the desert, each step feeling heavier than the last. The landscape around her shifted as if it were alive, the sand and rocks undulating in a way that made her feel like she was walking through a dream or a nightmare. The fog had begun to recede, but the land still felt oppressive, like it was closing in on her. It wasn't just the physical environment, it was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to uncover its secrets. Claire's mind raced. The name on the canyon wall, Rachel Matthews' name, had been carved there for a reason. It was a warning, a message. But what had Rachel meant when she said, "It's too late"? Had she realized in her final moments that the desert would never let her go? That she had crossed a line, and there was no turning back? Claire stopped walking for a moment, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She had come so close to uncovering the truth, but now she wasn't sure if she wanted to know any more. The eye, the desert, the force that had claimed Rachel, it wasn't something that could be understood. It wasn't something that could be defeated. It was a part of the land, a force that had existed for millennia, drawing in those who sought to understand it, only to consume them in the end. She had come here looking for answers, but now Claire realized that the desert was not a place that offered answers. It offered only silence, and the deeper she ventured into its heart, the more it would take from her. Rachel had been consumed by it, and now it was Claire's turn. But there was one last thing that Claire needed to do. One final piece of the puzzle that had been haunting her since the day she first stepped into the desert. She needed to find out what had happened to Rachel in the final moments before she vanished. Had she truly been consumed by the desert? Or was there something else, something darker, at play? Claire turned back toward the canyon, the fog once again closing in around her as she retraced her steps. She knew that the answers she sought were hidden there, buried in the heart of the desert. But as she approached the canyon's entrance, she felt the pull once again. The eye was waiting, watching, ready to claim her, just as it had claimed Rachel. And yet Claire couldn't turn away. She had to know. She had to understand, even if it meant losing herself to the desert forever. The canyon loomed ahead, its jagged cliffs rising from the earth like ancient sentinels. Claire stepped into the shadow of the canyon, the cold air wrapping around her, and she felt the weight of the desert's presence settle heavily on her shoulders. The land was alive, and it was watching. It was always watching. The deeper she ventured, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The familiar paths she had walked before seemed to blur, replaced by strange, winding trails that led nowhere. The trees, the rocks, the very earth beneath her feet seemed to change, as though the desert itself was reshaping itself in response to her presence. And then she saw it, the symbol again, etched into the stone, just like the one in the cave. It was the same, yet different, as if it had grown, become more pronounced, more intense. The eye. Claire felt the pull, the force drawing her closer, urging her to understand, to surrender to it. Her heart raced as she approached the stone. It was cold to the touch, its surface smooth and polished, yet it hummed with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Claire's hand hovered over it, and for a moment she hesitated. Was this the moment when she too would be consumed by the desert? Would she become another name etched into the canyon wall, another lost soul claimed by the eye? She pressed her hand against the stone. The world around her seemed to collapse. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The air grew thick with a palpable pressure, and Claire's vision blurred as the landscape shifted. The desert wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and she was its latest offering. The eye had drawn her in, just as it had drawn Rachel, just as it had drawn every other lost soul that had ever ventured too far into the desert's depths. Claire's mind raced as she fought to keep her grip on reality, but it was slipping away. The voices were louder now, filling her ears with whispers that she couldn't understand. The desert had claimed her, and there was no escape. The darkness closed in, the weight of the desert's power pressing down on her like a vice. She could feel it consuming her, erasing her from the world she had known. She had become part of the desert, part of the eye. And no matter how hard she fought, she knew it was too late. The desert had taken her, just as it had taken Rachel, just as it had taken so many others before her. There was no escaping its grasp, and Claire understood now. The desert had always been waiting for her. It had always been waiting for all of them. The weight of the desert pressed in on Claire, its oppressive presence consuming every ounce of her consciousness. The world around her felt distorted, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, the air thickening and warping. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of being drawn into something ancient, something vast and unknowable. She had made a decision to step closer to the center of it all, but now, as the eye pulsed with a sickening intensity, Claire realized the full weight of what she had uncovered. The desert was not just a vast expanse of arid land and desolate beauty, it was a living force, a force that had shaped the lives of those who wandered too close, claimed their souls, and buried them in the sand, forgotten by the world. She tried to focus, tried to push through the suffocating pressure that pressed against her chest, but every thought seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. The whispers returned, not just in her ears, but inside her mind, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The voices grew louder, blending with the wind, the rocks, the very fabric of the desert itself. You are here. You will never leave. Her vision blurred as she stumbled backward, her mind on the verge of unraveling. The desert wasn't just pulling her in, it was erasing her, turning her into a part of its twisted landscape. She had become a part of the land, just like Rachel. She could feel her sense of self slipping away, like an old memory fading into oblivion. She was no longer Claire Donovan, the journalist chasing answers. She was part of the desert now, a part of the eye. Desperation surged through her as she tried to focus on the world around her. She couldn't afford to lose herself, not yet, not after everything she had uncovered. The answers were so close, but the desert didn't want her to understand. It wanted her to forget, to surrender, to become another lost soul drifting in the dunes. No, she thought, clinging to the remnants of her sanity. I won't let it take me. Not like this. She turned on her heel and began to run, her feet stumbling through the uneven terrain as the wind whipped at her face. The fog, thick and suffocating, closed in around her like a living thing, but Claire pushed forward. She had to get out of here. She had to find a way to escape the eye. The path seemed endless, and with each step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The desert was closing in, and Claire could feel its grip tightening around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs heavy, but she refused to stop. She had to reach the edge. She had to break free before it consumed her completely. The world around her felt like it was shifting, twisting, bending in impossible ways. The landscape blurred as if it were slipping between realities, each moment stretching out in impossible ways. Claire's mind screamed for clarity, for some semblance of understanding, but the desert kept pulling, drawing her deeper into its depths. Finally, she stumbled to a halt at the edge of the canyon, the sheer drop before her barely visible in the dense fog. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but she forced herself to stand upright, her eyes wide and frantic. The canyon stretched out before her, its jagged edges lost in the mist. The whispers had stopped, but the presence of the desert was still there, looming over her, watching. Claire had made it this far, but now she was faced with a choice. Step into the unknown abyss of the canyon, or turn back and face the force that had already claimed so many. I can't go back, she thought, her mind racing. The desert won't let me. But something inside her refused to give in. She had uncovered the truth and she could feel it. There was a way out. The desert was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. She had seen Rachel's name on the canyon wall. She had seen the mark the desert left on those it claimed. It wasn't just a physical disappearance. It was something more. And if Rachel had been able to leave that message, then Claire could do the same. With a deep breath, Claire turned her back on the abyss and made her way back toward the heart of the desert. She couldn't let it claim her, not like this. Not without understanding the truth. She wasn't just going to disappear into the wind, lost and forgotten. The desert couldn't erase her. She would fight it with every ounce of strength she had left. But as she moved deeper into the canyon once more, the landscape shifted again, and Claire began to feel the weight of something far more unsettling. It was as if the canyon was changing, as if it were reacting to her presence, bending itself to the will of the force she had disturbed. The walls of the canyon seemed to close in, pressing on her from all sides, the rocks moving, shifting, becoming more jagged and dangerous with every step. It wasn't the desert anymore. It was the Eye, the ancient force that had lived in these lands long before any human being had set foot on this earth. The power of the desert was not just in its terrain, it was in the land itself, in the rocks, the caves, the wind. It was alive, watching, waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time, as if the desert had finally broken her resolve. You cannot escape. You belong to the Eye now. Claire's mind began to reel, but in the midst of the overwhelming chaos, she heard something. A faint sound, almost like a voice calling her name. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable. The name Rachel Matthews echoed in the air, and Claire froze, her blood running cold. Had Rachel been trying to reach her? Had Rachel, in her final moments, left a message, a warning? Or was it the desert, toying with her, pulling her deeper into the labyrinth? The ground beneath Claire's feet trembled once more, and she stumbled, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to her knees, the fog swirling around her like a suffocating embrace. The whispers were louder now, the voices speaking in unison, as if they were drawing her into their fold. You are here. You will never leave. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to keep her thoughts together. She could feel the desert's power coursing through the very earth beneath her, its tendrils wrapping around her mind, tightening with every passing second. But she would not give in. I'm not like her, Claire whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. I'm not like Rachel. I won't let it take me. With a burst of strength, Claire rose to her feet, determined to break free. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but she pushed forward, her resolve hardening with each step. She wouldn't be another name carved into the canyon wall. She wouldn't disappear into the desert's endless void. As Claire took another step, the fog began to clear, and for the first time, she saw the path ahead, a faint glimmer of light cutting through the mist. She wasn't sure how much longer the desert would allow her to resist, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to be consumed. Not like Rachel. Not like all the others. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let the desert win. Not this time. The fog that had once seemed suffocating now began to dissipate, lifting as if responding to Claire's determination. The desert still felt alive, its energy palpable in the air around her, but the force that had pulled her in, the Eye, was no longer suffocating her in the same way. She wasn't sure how long this newfound clarity would last, but for the first time since entering the canyon, she felt like she had a chance. She wasn't going to let the desert claim her. Not yet. Her heart raced as she took each step deeper into the canyon, each footfall ringing with a mix of fear and resolve. The rocky walls rose higher around her, jagged and unforgiving. Every inch of the path felt like it was shifting beneath her, like the very landscape was watching her every move, judging her, waiting for her to falter. The whispers were still there, but they had grown fainter, more distant, like they were retreating. It was strange, though. Even as the fog receded, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. The desert had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat, and though it felt quieter now, the land's weight on her shoulders had not diminished. She felt like she was still being drawn towards something she could not quite comprehend. There was no turning back, Claire realized. There was no leaving the desert, not after what she had discovered. The truth had changed her. She had uncovered something far beyond her understanding, something ancient and powerful. And now, she was part of it. The desert had marked her, just as it had marked Rachel, and there would be no escaping that connection. She reached the spot where Rachel's name had been etched into the stone, the wall of the canyon smooth and dark, the grooves where the letters had been carved still visible, though time and the elements had softened their edges. Claire ran her fingers along the surface, the cold stone feeling both alien and familiar under her touch. Rachel had been here, had left this mark as a message. But what had it meant? Had she known she wouldn't survive? Had Rachel, in her final moments, left this as a warning? The silence around Claire deepened, almost oppressive. For a moment, she could almost hear Rachel's voice, faint but clear. "I can't turn back now. It's too late." The words echoed in her mind, and Claire couldn't help but feel a deep sense of kinship with Rachel. They had both been pulled into this desert, drawn to something they couldn't understand. But unlike Rachel, Claire wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. There was still a chance to break free. She had to believe that. Stepping away from the etching, Claire glanced around the canyon, her eyes scanning the landscape. There were no signs of movement, no indications of anyone else being near. The desert felt still, almost too still, like it was holding its breath. And then, as if in response, the earth beneath her feet shifted again, subtle, imperceptible, but enough to make her stop. A sudden sense of dread washed over Claire. Her gut twisted with an uncomfortable certainty. The desert hadn't let her go. It wasn't done with her. She turned, her eyes darting back and forth, scanning the shifting fog and shadows. There was something else here, something that had been lying in wait, and Claire could feel its presence drawing closer. It wasn't just the desert this time. It was something else, something she hadn't expected. From deep within the canyon, a low, rumbling noise began to reverberate through the ground. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind, nor the shifting of the earth. It was something else, something that had been disturbed, something that had been awakened. Claire's heart raced as she backed away, her feet unsteady beneath her, and she listened, straining to identify the source. It came again, this time louder. The rumbling grew more intense, vibrating through the canyon walls. And then Claire saw it, something moving in the distance. The fog parted for a split second, revealing a figure standing at the far edge of the canyon. At first, she thought it was a mirage, her exhausted mind playing tricks on her. But then the figure moved again, stepping out from the mist and into the dim light. It was tall, its outline obscured by the fog, but it was unmistakably human in shape. A shadow. No, a person. But who? Claire's breath caught in her throat. Was it a hiker? Another lost soul? Someone who had ventured into the canyon and was now drawn into the same trap? Or was it something else, something far darker, tied to the ancient force of the desert? She couldn't tell, but every instinct in her screamed to run, but her feet were frozen. She couldn't look away. She had to know who or what this figure was. The figure took another step, and then, to Claire's horror, it turned toward her. The mist swirled around its figure, obscuring its face, but Claire could feel its gaze on her. Cold, empty eyes, like those of someone who had been lost to the desert for far too long. It took another step, moving closer. No, Claire thought, a surge of panic rising within her. She had come so far. She couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, claim her now. Not when she had come so close to understanding. Not when she was finally on the verge of unraveling the mystery. The rumbling deepened, the ground shaking under her feet as the figure advanced. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and she forced herself to take a step backward. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and for the first time since entering the canyon, she felt truly alone, like the desert had swallowed everything around her, leaving only her and whatever this figure was. It was then, as she took another shaky step back, that the voice returned, louder now, its words filling her mind with a sickening clarity. "You cannot leave. You are part of the desert now. Part of the Eye." Claire's breath caught, and she realized the terrifying truth. This figure, this presence, wasn't just part of the desert. It was a manifestation of the very force that had drawn her here, of the eye that had claimed Rachel and countless others before her. It had taken the form of a person, a lost soul forever bound to the land. The rumbling grew louder, and the figure began to move faster, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was no longer fully human, but something else, something far older, far more sinister, and Claire knew, deep in her bones, that there was no escaping it. The desert would claim her. It would claim them all. As the figure moved closer, she realized one thing with devastating certainty. The desert had been waiting for her. It had always been waiting, and now it would never let her go. The figure was moving faster now, the ground trembling beneath Claire's feet, as if the very earth itself was reacting to its approach. The fog clung to the canyon walls like a suffocating shroud, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee, but her legs refused to obey. Her body felt as if it had been frozen in place, caught in the grip of the desert itself. The figure's movements were jerky, unnaturally so, as if it was stumbling through a dream. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible through the thick mist. But what struck Claire was the way it moved, slowly at first, but with a growing urgency. It was coming toward her, its presence growing stronger, its intent unmistakable. The rumbling beneath her feet intensified, and the wind began to howl through the canyon, carrying with it a strange, otherworldly hum that vibrated deep within her chest. And then, in a split second, Claire understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a person. This wasn't a lost hiker or another soul wandering the desert. This was a manifestation, a part of the desert itself, the eye in physical form. It was a being tied to the land, to the ancient force that had been pulling her toward it from the very beginning. It was one of the desert's lost souls, bound to the land for eternity, its body nothing more than an empty vessel for the force that consumed it. The realization struck her like a punch to the gut. She had thought she could escape. She had thought she could leave, that she could uncover the truth without being taken in herself. But the desert had been waiting for her. It had drawn her in, just like it had drawn Rachel, just like it had drawn so many others before her. And now, she was part of it. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed in her mind once more, its tone deeper, more insistent. "You belong to the desert now. You belong to the eye." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The figure was still moving toward her, its footsteps slow but deliberate. Its presence was suffocating, its gaze unblinking, even though its face was obscured by the fog. She could feel it. It was watching her, waiting for her to surrender, waiting for her to give in. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though the desert itself was pressing in on her, closing her off from the rest of the world. The canyon walls seemed to close in around her, their jagged edges growing sharper with every step. The hum of the desert, the rumble from deep within the earth, was growing louder, reverberating through her bones, rattling her senses. Claire's mind raced. She couldn't let it take her. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the same force that had taken Rachel, that had taken so many others before her. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free, to sever the connection between herself and the desert. She remembered the cave, the altar, the symbol. She had touched it, felt the energy surge through her, and for a brief moment it had seemed like she could break free. Maybe that was it. Maybe the desert could be beaten, not with force, but with understanding. She had to confront the force within the land, confront the eye itself, but the figure was getting closer. Every step it took was deliberate, as though it knew that Claire had nowhere to run. The distance between them closed, and Claire could feel the oppressive weight of its presence bearing down on her. It was only a matter of time before it reached her, before the desert consumed her, just like it had consumed Rachel. Suddenly, Claire remembered something that Rachel had written in her journal, the phrase, "I feel like I'm being pulled toward something, but I can't stop." Rachel had known. She had understood. She had felt the pull too, but Rachel hadn't known how to stop it. Maybe Claire did. Maybe the answer wasn't to fight the desert. Maybe it was to confront it head on, to acknowledge its power and break the cycle that had been repeating itself for so long. Claire turned, facing the mist-covered canyon ahead of her, the figure still moving toward her, its footsteps echoing in the quiet, suffocating space. She wasn't going to run. Not anymore. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength she had left, and walked toward the figure. As she did, the rumbling grew louder, the hum of the desert vibrating through her body, but she didn't stop. She stepped closer to it, the fog parting with each step, revealing the shadow of the figure standing before her. The air felt thick, dense with energy, and Claire could hear the whispers again, louder this time, surrounding her, filling her mind. But this time, she didn't resist. She didn't fight it. She let the desert into her, let the power of the eye fill her, just as it had filled Rachel before her. She understood now. It was not something to fight. It was something to accept, to acknowledge, and to let go of. As she stood before the figure, her heart racing, she could feel the presence around her. It was not the desert that was the enemy. It was the fear of it, the fear of being consumed, of being lost forever. The desert had always been waiting for her to surrender, to embrace its pull. And now, Claire was ready. The figure reached out, but instead of pulling her into the darkness, it seemed to fade, its form dissipating into the mist, as if it had never existed at all. The rumbling faded with it, and the fog began to clear, revealing the jagged, desolate beauty of the canyon. Claire stood alone, but not in the same way as before. She wasn't free, but she wasn't trapped either. The desert had claimed her, but it had not taken everything. It had left her with something, understanding, acceptance. As she turned to walk away, her steps no longer felt heavy. The pull of the desert still lingered, but it wasn't as suffocating. The eye was always watching, always waiting, but Claire had found a way to live with it, to coexist with it. The canyon was quiet now, and as Claire stepped into the fading light of the desert, she understood that she was no longer just a visitor. She was part of it. And though the desert would always claim those who wandered too far, it would never completely take them, not if they knew how to listen. And as she walked away, the whispers in the wind grew faint. The desert had not claimed her completely, not yet, but it would always be there, waiting. The desert had swallowed Claire, but it hadn't claimed her completely, not yet. She walked through the canyon, her body still vibrating with the pull of the land, but something had changed. There was no longer an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The desert was still alive with its ancient force, but Claire had faced it, and in some small way, she had won. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The path before her was still shrouded in mystery, the shifting sands of time blurring her past with the present. The fog, though less dense now, still swirled at her feet, reminding her that nothing was ever as it seemed in this desert. The ground beneath her felt less solid, as if the earth was still in the process of shifting, waiting for her next misstep. She had taken the first step in acknowledging the desert's power, in understanding it, but that didn't mean it was done with her. The voices, the pull, the strange figure, they were still there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. She could feel them when she closed her eyes. But now she held the key. Now she knew how to survive it. For the first time, Claire could breathe a little easier, though her heart still beat erratically, the fear from her encounter with the figure lingering in her chest. She was no longer running. She had stopped running. But the desert had a way of luring people back, of drawing them deeper into its labyrinth of sand and shadow. Claire wasn't sure she could leave it entirely behind. As she walked, she noticed something strange. The canyon that had felt so alive with oppressive energy before had grown quiet. The whispers in her mind had faded to a hum, no longer demanding her attention. The air felt thinner, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the jagged rocks that surrounded her. It almost felt like the land was letting her go, releasing its grip for now. But it wasn't just the landscape that had changed, it was something deeper inside Claire, something she couldn't quite name. The desert had left its mark on her, just as it had marked Rachel, and perhaps others too. She was forever tied to it now, woven into the fabric of this ancient land. And that understanding, that connection, was something that could never be undone. She continued her trek through the canyon, the darkening sky above her gradually transforming into a blanket of stars. The temperature dropped sharply as the sun disappeared completely, the biting chill of the desert night creeping in. But Claire didn't mind. She had been here before, alone in the wild, her senses sharp, her mind clear. She felt like she belonged here now, as much a part of this land as the stones beneath her feet. Still, questions lingered. The mystery of Rachel's disappearance, the strange etching on the canyon wall, the whispers that Claire had felt. These things would never leave her. She was no longer simply investigating someone else's disappearance. She had become part of it, and that realization settled in with a heavy, eerie finality. She passed the place where Rachel's name had been carved. The symbol, faint in the moonlight, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as if the desert was reminding her that the story wasn't over. Not for Rachel, not for her, and certainly not for anyone else who had been drawn into its depths. But for Claire, there was no longer fear. There was understanding. The desert, with its untold mysteries and its unyielding power, had a way of claiming those who wandered too far. It didn't kill them, though. It didn't erase them from the earth. It simply made them a part of itself, hidden in the landscape, in the whispers of the wind, in the shifting shadows of the canyon walls. She didn't know how long she had walked when she finally stopped, the exhaustion of her journey catching up with her. The canyon stretched out before her, a labyrinth of rocks and stone, the faintest trace of fog still clinging to the ground. But there was a quiet now, a peace, as if the desert had settled into a calm rhythm after its storm of energy. And in that moment, Claire realized the truth. She had not escaped. No one ever truly escaped the desert, not those who had come before her, not Rachel, and certainly not herself. But she was no longer afraid of it. The desert had claimed her, yes, but it had given her something in return, understanding. Her mind drifted back to the journal she had found in Rachel's backpack, to the last entry, where Rachel had written, "I can't turn back now. It's too late." Claire understood now. It wasn't just that the desert had taken Rachel. It had accepted her, woven her into the land, and left her name behind as a marker for those who would follow. Just as Rachel had become a part of the desert, Claire had too. She took a deep breath and exhaled, the cool desert air filling her lungs. The desert was vast, and it would never let her go. But now she knew that she didn't have to fight it. She could exist within it, as part of it. As Claire moved forward once again, the canyon slowly narrowing before her, the stars above glistening like diamonds in the black sky, she could feel it, a shift, a pull, just beneath the surface. The desert wasn't done with her, but she was no longer running. The desert would always be waiting, always watching. But Claire understood now. She had become one with it. And somehow, she had found peace in that knowledge. The desert had claimed her, but it had also given her the truth she had been searching for all along. And as the wind whispered through the canyon once more, Claire knew the desert would always be a part of her. It was not a curse. It was not a punishment. It was simply the way of the land, the way of the eye, and it was her truth now. The desert stretched endlessly before her, the horizon a blur of jagged rocks and barren earth. Claire walked, her feet shifting through the warm sand, the weight of the desert settling into her bones. The fog, once thick and suffocating, had receded. It was a rare, clear night in the Arizona wilderness. The stars above shone brilliantly, their cold light piercing the darkness, and for a moment it felt like the universe itself had been laid out before her, vast and infinite. But there was no peace in this clarity. Claire felt the oppressive pull of the desert still, deep inside her. The land had claimed her, just as it had claimed Rachel, just as it had claimed so many before them. It wasn't just the desert anymore. It was part of her too. The connection was inescapable. She reached the edge of the canyon, where the stone walls met the open expanse of sand and scrub. This was where it had all started, where the desert had drawn her in, just as it had drawn Rachel. And now she stood at the precipice, the whispers of the wind in her ears, the hum of the land vibrating through her chest. The eye was watching her still. It had never let go. Her fingers brushed against the rock at her side, cold and smooth beneath her touch, and she felt the ancient power that had pulsed through it earlier. The markings, the symbol, Rachel's name carved into the wall, they had been more than just a message. They were a marker for all who had wandered too far into the desert, all who had been taken by the land. It was as though the desert had an insatiable hunger, one that devoured those who sought to uncover its secrets, and once it had them, it would never let them go. Claire's breath was steady now, though her mind was racing. She knew she would never be the same again. She would never be able to return to her old life, to the world she had once known. The desert had claimed her, not just physically, but in a deeper, more profound way. She wasn't sure if she was still Claire Donovan, the journalist chasing answers, or if she had become something else entirely, something that was part of the desert's eternal story. Turning away from the canyon, Claire walked back toward the trail that led out of the wilderness, her footsteps soft in the sand. The whispers that had followed her all this time were still there, but now they seemed distant, as if the desert was speaking to her from afar, its voice fading like a memory. She didn't know if Rachel had felt the same way, but Claire couldn't shake the thought that Rachel's disappearance had been no accident. It hadn't been the desert simply swallowing her whole. It had chosen her to be part of its eternal cycle. The desert had a way of marking those who came too close, of weaving them into its fabric. And now, Claire realized, she was part of that fabric, bound to the land as much as Rachel had been. She had tried to run, to fight the pull, but the desert had been patient. It had waited, and now it had taken its claim. And yet, in the strange stillness of the night, Claire found something unexpected. Peace. It wasn't the peace of escape. It wasn't the peace of freedom. It was something deeper, a kind of quiet understanding, like she had finally come to terms with her place in the vastness of the desert. The night air grew colder, the wind picking up again, and Claire pulled her jacket tighter around her body, as though protecting herself from something she couldn't name. She thought back to Rachel's last journal entry, to the words she had written before she disappeared. I feel like I'm being pulled towards something, but I can't stop. Rachel hadn't stopped. She had surrendered to the desert, just as Claire had, just as so many before them had. The desert took them. It took their essence, their spirit, and made them part of the land. There was no escape, no way to turn back once the desert had drawn its mark, but Claire wasn't afraid anymore. She understood now. The desert wasn't a punishment. It wasn't something to be feared. It was simply the way of the land, the eye that watched, the force that had always been there. It was a truth older than civilization itself, a truth Claire had uncovered with her own eyes. As Claire reached the edge of the wilderness, she turned one last time to look at the desert. The canyon, the rocks, the dunes. They were all part of the same living, breathing entity. The desert had claimed Rachel, but it had claimed Claire too. And though she could never truly leave, she knew that she had become part of its story, just as Rachel had. The wind howled again, and Claire closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. She had come to the desert seeking answers, but in the end, it had given her something else, a connection, a bond that could never be broken. When she opened her eyes again, the desert was quiet. The stars above seemed brighter now, more vivid, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire smiled. The desert had claimed her, yes, but it had also given her the truth, and in that truth, she found peace. She turned away from the wilderness, the weight of the desert's grip still heavy on her shoulders, but somehow lighter. The desert would always be with her. The eye would always watch. But Claire had learned to live with it. She had learned to accept her place in the land's eternal cycle. And as she walked away, she knew one thing for certain. The desert had claimed her, but it had also given her the greatest gift of all: understanding, acceptance, and the knowledge that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. They were simply meant to be lived, and Claire had learned to live with the desert forever.